Today we're going to talk about a little design detail that can make your sites very tricky to use on mobile devices if you're not careful about it. So take a look at this example I've got here. This is the protocol documentation template that we built as part of Tailwind Plus a while back. And if you take a look at the nav bar here, we've got these cool icon buttons at the top. I think these look great and are sort of appropriately sized visually for the UI. But if you think about trying to use these on mobile, these are pretty small and might be hard to hit with your thumb. So let's talk through a few different ways that you can solve this problem. Before I do anything, I'm just going to add a background color to this button so we can sort of always see it. Maybe we'll make it a little bit darker than that. Okay, so we've got this background color on this button now so we can always see how much space it's taking up in the UI. So I think the first thing to understand is the recommended size for touch targets on mobile devices. Depending on where you look, you'll see recommendations usually between 44 pixels, which I think comes from the Apple Human Interface Guidelines, and 48 pixels by 48 pixels is another common sort of minimum size recommendation that you'll see from a bunch of different sources. So how can we actually make this button bigger? So one thing that we could do, of course, is just make the button bigger, increase the hover area and all that stuff, and change the design to sort of accommodate that. I would love to avoid that because I think visually this looks really good. I don't want to make the icons bigger. I don't want to make the visual hover states bigger. I just don't want to screw with the design. I just want to make the buttons easier to tap. So let's walk through one sort of naive solution for solving this that you might have tried in the past if you've ever been aware of this problem. So we got this button here. It's size 6, which I think is 24 by 24 pixels, which is, quite a bit smaller than the recommended 44 or 48 pixels. So the first thing that we could do is we could just increase the size of this button, right? So instead of increasing the size of the whole thing, because again, I don't want to mess with these nice little hover states, I'm going to add an extra element inside of this, move the SVG to that span, and I'm going to copy a bunch of the classes from the actual button to see which ones we need. So we need to keep like the size and the flex stuff. We probably don't need this position relative thing. The border radius. Let's get rid of the background color. We'll keep that just on the actual button so we can see the size of the button. And then we'll go up to the parent here and we'll sort of do the same thing. We can get rid of the border radius. Get rid of the transition and the hover state. Keep the flex stuff though, because we want things to be centered. So right now the button and the sort of visual button inside of it are the same size. Let's bump this button up to 11 would be 44 by 44 pixels. 12 will be 48 pixels. So why don't we roll with 48? We'll make this a nice, big, comfortable touch target. So you can see the touch target is bigger now, but it's messed with the layout, right? Everything is sort of shifted in. And if we get rid of the background color for a second here, you can see just how sort of off balanced and messed up things actually look because things sort of aren't in the place that optically we want them to be in. So to solve this, we have to sort of try and compensate for this change in size. So if you take a look here, the difference between this and this is 6, right? Divide that by 2 and we know how much to add or subtract from each side of the button. So if you look up here, this PX4 is what's controlling the space on the outside of this nav bar. Since we've made this button 6 units bigger or 24 pixels bigger, we're gonna have to subtract 12 pixels, So let's go over here and instead of having it be PX4, which is going to be 16 pixels on both sides, we're going to have to subtract 12 from that for the left side. So we'll override the padding on the left to just be PL1. And now that should optically be in the same place that it was in before. The next thing that you'll notice is the gap. So the gap between this button and this logo. It's optically a lot bigger than it was before. We need to make the same change. So we need to subtract 3 from the 5, bring it down to 2. And now everything is back to the right size, right? And if we get rid of this background color again, now things look the way that they did before, but the touch target is nice and big. I don't think this is a good solution, mostly because it leaks a bunch of details about this change throughout different parts of the application. If we wanted to change this to 44 instead of 48, we'd have to remember to go up here, and I think this would have to go up to 1.5. This would go to 2.5. It's just all this stuff is sort of scattered everywhere. It's not nicely encapsulated, and it's a pain to maintain and a pain to change. So let's try a different solution that prevents some of these details from leaking everywhere in the application, and I think is a little bit nicer. Let's undo some of the stuff that we did here. We'll bring this back to just the PX4 and the gap 5. So everything is sort of ugly here and the layout is messed up again and stuff like that. But what we can do instead is we can make this button itself responsible for compensating for its sort of ballooned up size. And we can do that with negative margins. So like we mentioned, we made this thing 3 sort of Tailwind units, or whatever that is, 12 pixels bigger on all sides. So if we add a negative margin, like negative M3, that should have the same effect. Cross your fingers if you're lucky. That's sort of the thing with negative margins, right? They are a very useful tool, but personally, I find that almost any time I'm using negative margins, I literally am crossing my fingers, hoping that it's going to do the thing that I expect it to do. A lot of the time it works, a lot of the time it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, it takes a lot of effort and troubleshooting to try and figure out what's going on. Maybe you apply a negative margin to all sides of an item and it works on the left-hand side, but it's not pulling things on the right-hand side for some reason. And I have to add some wrapper element, or the margins are being collapsed because 2 margins are touching between 2 other things. There's all sorts of confusing, sort of hard to wrap your brain around things that can happen when you're playing with negative margins. So if I can find a solution that doesn't involve negative margins, that's usually my preference. So I'm going to show you one more solution here that I think is very clever and very maintainable and avoids these problems that I love dropping into my projects when I need to solve this problem. Let's get rid of this negative margin again. And actually, you know what? Let's undo all this back to the very original state that we're in without this extra span or anything, okay? So we're back to the original design here. The button is back to just being 24 pixels. We're not increasing the touch target size or anything. What can we do here to get things working? This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to add an extra span again, but this time I'm not going to use it to wrap the SVG. I'm just going to drop it into the button. And I'm going to give this some classes. So first, I'm going to make this position absolute, and it's going to be relative to the button since the button was already position relative. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the size of this span the size that we want the touch target to be. So we wanted it to be 48 by 48, right? So size 12. So now I've added this element. Now we've got the background color on this button, right? Set to this blue color. You can see the button size didn't actually change. But let me add like a background of maybe like, I don't know, pink or something to this span. And you can see this span is way bigger than the actual button. And because the span is a child of the button, even though the button is only set to size 6, clicking the span is going to count as a click on the button. So we've effectively increased the touch target size of this button by putting a bigger element inside of it. Now you might have noticed that this is conveniently already centered around the button. We sort of got lucky there because the button was using flex, item center, justify center, which is making this thing be centered. If you're working in a project where you're trying to use this technique in a button that isn't already centering its contents, you can do top 1/2, left 1/2, negative translate 1/2. And this will do the exact same thing, but now you're forcing it to be centered. So now it'll be centered no matter what, even if you weren't doing flex stuff on the parent. So if you wanted to wrap this up into like a reusable component of some kind, I would encourage you to include these styles because it makes it a little bit more bulletproof. So let's get rid of these background colors for a second. I want to show you one remaining subtle issue here. Maybe you guessed what it is, maybe you haven't. If we take our mouse and we start hovering near the button, you'll see the hover state for the button kicks in way earlier than you would expect. So my mouse cursor is way outside of sort of the visual hover area, but the hover state is showing up. Now this is kind of nice to see in some ways. We're sort of proving that the actual click target of the button is big, like we expected. But it is a weird experience on desktop to move your mouse near a button and have the hover state trigger when it doesn't feel like you're actually hovering over the button. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we introduced this span because we want the touch target to be bigger on mobile devices for people using their thumbs to click things. It's not as important for someone using their mouse, where they have that precise pointer and they can move it exactly where they want and they know exactly where they're clicking. So we could just not increase the size of the touch target for desktop users, right? So naively, you might think that, oh, we can just do that by maybe doing SM hidden. And now this whole span is going to be hidden for larger screens. And now if we go over to the example here, you can see, okay, we're still on a small screen, so we still have that increased touch target size. But if I drag this thing up past 640, which is the Tailwind's small breakpoint, now the hover state doesn't trigger until I get right into the button. So this might seem like a good solution at first, but viewport size isn't really tightly correlated with the sort of input mechanism that someone's using to use a site, right? We're just making this based on the size of the screen, but an iPad is a big screen and people are using iPads with their fingers all day long. So I don't think it's a good idea to tie this functionality to the screen size. We need a better way to tell if the person is using their finger or using something like a mouse. Thankfully, CSS does have a feature that gives us this information. So there's this media query in CSS. It looks like this in vanilla CSS. So you can just do media pointer, and this has two different options. There's fine, which tells you the person is using a pointer with like fine precision control, like a mouse, or coarse. Sorry, not coarse, coarse, which is something like your finger, where you only have coarse precision. Tailwind doesn't have any variant out of the box for targeting this media query, but we can use Tailwind's arbitrary variants to still take advantage of this feature anyways. So let's head up back to our span here, and instead of using SM and only targeting small screens here, let's do an arbitrary variant with square brackets where we say media, pointer, fine, hidden. So now on any device where the primary pointing mechanism has fine precision support, this span is going to be hidden. So now you can see, even though we're on a small screen, that hover state doesn't trigger until we get to where the actual button is. But if we were on a touch device where this wasn't triggering, or we can sort of simulate this by saying like pointer coarse hidden, you know, sort of the reverse. Well, now we're back to this triggering even though I'm using the mouse. And that's going to be the case no matter what the screen size is. So yeah, media, pointer, fine, hidden. The nice thing I love about this solution is all of the logic for what we're trying to do here is encapsulated entirely in this span. Nothing leaks out. The only small detail that leaks out a little bit is the fact that we have to have position relative on this button so that this is being absolute positioned relative to that element. But we don't have to mess with this padding. We don't have to mess with this gap. We don't have to worry about weird side effects from negative margins. Everything is handled here. There's no increase in size on the button. This element, just the presence of it, whether it's there or not, is what controls the size of the touch target. And it being there or not being there doesn't affect anything else about the layout. I find it to be just a beautiful solution to this problem, especially combined with this cool, fairly modern CSS media query, where we can only have this kick in for people that actually need it on touch devices. It's really great. So if you haven't been doing this in your projects, highly recommend you sort of audit your work, look for those really small touch targets that you might have, and consider slapping the solution in there so that people using mobile devices can click what they need to click way more easily.